Hello, and welcome back to Lecture 9 of the Foundations in Kinematic Analysis lecture series. In the previous lecture, you learned how to identify the moment of peak gesture speed for each gesture stroke and compute the temporal distance between gesture speed peaks and peaks in speech amplitude or loudness. Today, we will use gesture speed to calculate two new measures that capture the temporal properties of gesture submovements and holds. Let's get started. I want to start with a brief overview of how gestures are organized. Gestures can be broken down into distinct smaller phases. The first phase is called the preparation phase. This is the moment that brings the hands into a ready position to produce a gesture stroke. A preparation phase can start from a resting position or from the hand configuration of a previous gesture. The next phase is the stroke. The stroke is the only obligatory phase of a gesture. It is typically the part of the gesture we analyze in the field of gesture studies because it is the meaningful portion of the gesture that conveys the semantic or pragmatic content. And it is also the most kinematically salient movement. Hold phases are optional, but there is something we are particularly interested in this lecture. A hold can occur before a stroke, which is called a pre-stroke hold, or after a stroke, which is called a post-stroke hold. It refers to a pause in hand movement when movement is suspended, but the hands remain communicatively active in a non-resting position. Finally, the retraction or recovery phase is a moment where the hands return to a relaxed or resting position. These four components make up a gesture phrase. In this example, we have a sequence of 4 gesture phrases, where the speaker produces 4 gesture strokes in a row and produces some post-stroke holds before launching into the next gesture stroke. A single gesture phrase corresponds to the trajectory of one gesture. Multiple gesture phrases can be organized into a gesture unit. A gesture unit is the entire movement signal from the moment a speaker lifts their hands from a resting position until they return to a resting position. So we have gesture phases inside gesture phrases inside gesture units. When we look at gesture submovements and holds, we are examining how a movement signal is temporally segmented, and this reflects on the structural organization of these different phases. So let's start with gesture submovements. This analysis looks at how we can break down a continuous movement signal into smaller movement units. For example, each back and forth movement of a hand waving. First, we'll start with a conceptual definition of a gesture submovement. A gesture submovement is a discrete ballistic unit of motion within a larger gesture. You can think of this as a burst of motion. Changes in speed or direction mark transitions between distinct submovements. And the number of submovements within a given gesture can be an indication of how much movement repetition there is, how clearly segmented a signal is, or how complex it is. To give you an example, imagine a hammering motion. If I were to gesture hammering a nail, I would probably produce multiple forward and backward movements. Each of these movements is a distinct burst of motion and could be considered a gesture submovement within a larger gesture stroke. If you think about a hammer gesture, you might have an intuitive sense of what a gesture submovement is. But how do we identify gesture submovements kinematically? For this, I'm going to give you a kinematic definition, which will hopefully become clearer with the examples that follow. From a technical standpoint, we define a gesture submovement as a local maximum in the wrist speed signal characterized by a continuous acceleration phase and followed by a deceleration phase. So think about that forward stroke of the hammer gesture. When I start, my speed is near 0. Then I accelerate at some point reaching a peak speed and then decelerate at the end of the movement before I change direction. So this single rapid movement contains an acceleration phase, a peak speed, and a deceleration phase. This is what we're looking for. When we identify gesture submovements, we're going to define a few parameters or criteria that submovements must meet. This includes a minimum speed the wrist must reach, how high it rises from the baseline speed around it, and how far apart in time two submovements can be. We refer to these as height, prominence, and distance, and I'll give you some concrete examples now. So here you see a plot of the right wrist speed over time for the first 22 seconds of one of our participant videos. Let's look at one gesture submovement together. Remember, we are looking for moments where speed peaks during a short time window. So this is an example where the speed peaks around 2.5 units per second. The speed starts near 0, then accelerates to 2.5 units per second, then decelerates close to around 0.2 units per second. We consider this entire unit a gesture submovement. This is hopefully a clear example, but now let me ask you a harder question. How many gesture submovements do you see? This is difficult to answer because it is a continuous movement signal. This is where height, prominence, and the distance parameters that we define are really important for defining what is a true gesture submovement and what is just a small bump or fluctuation within a larger movement. So let me show you how they work with a simpler example. Imagine a mountain range that looks like this. I could ask you a similar question. How many mountains do you see? To answer this question, we have to decide what counts as a mountain. For example, we can probably all agree that this is a mountain. Why? Because it's tall and it stands out against the others. What about this one? Do you think it's a mountain? If yes, what is it about this mountain that makes it stand out from the others? And how do we make a decision when it comes to cases like this one? Is this its own mountain? Or is it just a small bump on the way to a taller mountain peak? When we are identifying gesture submovements and a continuous movement signal, these are the fundamental questions we're trying to answer. What counts as a speed peak, and how many speed peaks are there? So the first parameter we need to set is height. Height defines the minimum speed a hand must reach to be considered a submovement. This is analogous to how tall a mountain must be from sea level. For example, we could set a minimum height threshold of 3, and that would mean that any peaks shorter than 3 units do not count as mountains. In this case, we could say that if the hand does not reach at least 3 units per second, it's not the speed peak of a submovement. The next parameter is prominence. Prominence measures how much a peak stands out relative to its surroundings. More specifically, it's the height of a peak relative to the lowest valley you must cross to reach a taller peak. So let's look at an example. Imagine you're a hiker standing on this peak. First, we're going to look left and find the nearest peak that is taller than our current peak. So the nearest taller peak is this one, indicated with the star. Now we need to find the lowest point the hiker must descend to before climbing to this higher peak. We look at the entire path between these two peaks and we find the lowest point in that path. We have 2 valleys between these peaks, but the first valley is a little bit lower. The difference between the peak height and this valley gives us the reference level on the left side. The height is represented by the length of the orange arrow. Now, from the same peak, we're going to look right. However, this time there is no taller peak on the right side. So in this case, we continue all the way to the edge of the mountain range, and we look for the lowest point along this path. In this case, the lowest point is at the very edge of the signal. So from the right side, we would take the height of the current peak minus the height of this lowest point in the remaining signal to see how much the peak stands out. So let's bring back the left side arrow. So at this point, we have a valley on the left and a valley on the right. The prominence of the peak is determined using the higher of these two valleys, which for us is the valley on the left. So we subtract that value from the peak height to get its prominence. So for this particular peak, we would consider the prominence to be about 2.5 units using the left side valley as the reference. Another intuitive way to think about prominence is with a flooding analogy. Imagine water slowly rising over the landscape. At first, everything is connected. As the water rises, valleys flood and peaks begin to form islands. The prominence of a peak is the height from the top of the peak down to the water level at which it merges with a taller peak. So in our motion tracking analysis, we will also set a threshold for prominence. For example, we could say that in order to be considered a speed peak, the speed must be at least 1.5 units per second higher than the valley connecting it to a taller peak. The last parameter we'll define is distance. This refers to the minimum distance one speed peak should be from another. In our case, distance refers to time, so how close in time to submovement speed peaks can be to each other. For example, we could say that speed peaks must be at least 200 milliseconds from each other. Now let's go back to the real example from our data set. So here is the same speed plot we saw earlier for the first 22 seconds of one of our videos. Let's see what happens when we adjust some of the parameters we just discussed. The black points indicate speed peaks that we identified as representing gesture submovements. Here, we've set a height threshold to 0.5, which means that the hand must be moving at least 0.5 units per second to be considered a speed peak. This threshold is indicated by the horizontal dashed line, and you can see that there are no speed peaks below that line. We set prominence to 1, which means that the speed of the peak relative to the surrounding speed signal should be at least 1 unit per second faster. And the distance is set to 500 milliseconds, so two speed peaks shouldn't occur within the same half second. Using these parameters, we've identified quite a few speed peaks, but it's possible we're also missing some. So let's see what happens when we decrease our prominence threshold. In this example, we've decreased prominence from 1 unit to 0.5 units and gained 4 more speed peaks. Next, let's see what happens if we decrease our distance threshold. In this example, we've decreased the required distance from 500 milliseconds to 200 milliseconds, and now we've added another 7 speed peaks to the plot. We can see the effect that changing these thresholds has on our results. So hopefully you're asking yourself, how should I decide what threshold to use for these parameters? There are no set guidelines for these values, and they'll depend on the scale of your speed data. For example, if you normalized your motion tracking data in a different way than I did, or you didn't normalize at all, a height of 0.5 might not make any sense. If instead your speed ranges from 0 to 400 pixels per second, you should choose thresholds on that scale. Although I can't tell you what values to use for your data, I can describe the way I tried to choose threshold values in a principled manner. So let's start with looking at our raw video data, which I always recommend checking with your kinematic analysis results. I've actually slowed the video of this stroke down to half speed to help us try to count the submovements. So how many ballistic movements do you see? I see one clear forward motion, one clear motion back to the face, and one clear motion forward again. So I would call this 3 submovements within a gesture stroke. Now let's look at the speed signal for this gesture. Let's focus on the right hand, which is represented by the green line. We can see that his hand starts at near 0 speed, then speeds up as he brings his hand forward, but before slowing down to change direction. Now it's speeding up back toward his face, slowing down to change direction, and finally speeding up again as the hand moves forward before slowing down as he reaches his end point. So these 3 bumps correspond to the peak speed of each of these 3 movements, going out, coming back to the face, and going back out. So let's look at how far apart these peaks are. These speed peaks are about 300 milliseconds away from each other. In order to detect all 3 of these as distinct speed peaks, we would need to set a minimum distance of at least 270 milliseconds. Now, let's take a look at the height of these peaks. Our smallest submovement peak has a speed of 0.83 units per second. So, to detect all 3 of these as distinct submovements, we would need a minimum height of at least around 0.8 units per second. Now let's take a look at prominence. The valley next to our smallest peak has a speed of 0.26 units per second. And we just said the height of the peak is 0.83 units per second. So we would need a prominence of at least 0.57 to detect this as a speed peak. Now let's take a quick look at what the left hand is doing. This stroke is annotated in ELAN as being a right hand only stroke, but we can see that the left hand is also moving quite a bit. In fact, there are 2 bumps in the left hand that seem to be fairly synchronized to the speed peaks of the right hand. If we look at the video, we can see that even though the left hand doesn't seem to be moving very intentionally, it is still affected by the movement of the right hand. This is probably more so the case because the participant is standing. If they were sitting, their non-active hand might be in a more stable resting position. Ideally, we want our thresholds to be sensitive enough to detect speed peaks reflecting true gesture submovements, but specific enough that we don't capture unintended movements or small pulses in speed that aren't perceptually distinct. One thing we would expect from our data is that every gesture stroke has at least one submovement or speed peak. A gesture stroke is defined as the meaningful, kinematically salient phase of a gesture. To decide on our distance threshold, we're going to look at the smallest duration of gesture strokes in our dataset. Our shortest stroke is 233 milliseconds long, which I'll play for you now. And I'll play it one more time. So we will set a minimum distance to 200 milliseconds to make sure that we're capturing very rapid gesture submovements like this one. In this plot, you see the right wrist speed signal for all 8 participants in our dataset. Each participant video is represented by a different color, and we've zoomed into the first 15 seconds of the videos. These participants gesture a lot, so we see lots of speed peaks, but we also see that their wrists are always moving a little bit. They're never fully at rest, which again is probably amplified because they are standing. As I said before, it's not possible to identify a single height threshold value that works for all data sets. Instead, we are going to use an adaptive threshold based on our data set that can easily be applied to other data sets as well. So we calculate the median speed of the left and right wrists across the entire time series and across all participants. This calculation includes moments when the participants are actively gesturing and when they're at rest. In order to count as the speed peak of a gesture submovement, we define that the wrist must move at a speed faster than the median wrist speed in our dataset. In our dataset, this gives us a minimum height threshold of 0.2 units per second, which is indicated by the horizontal dashed line. So gesture submovement peaks must be higher than this line. We're actually going to use the exact same adaptive threshold for our prominence parameter. So taking the median speed of the left and right wrists across the entire data set. This means that relative to its surrounding valleys, a gesture submovement peak must stand out by at least the median speed magnitude. Again, in our data set, this is 0.2 units per second. This is the first 15 seconds of one of our videos. Using these thresholds, you can see the gesture submovement peaks that we identified. The orange vertical brackets indicate the prominence of each peak. Here you can see that we have some small peaks that just meet our prominence criteria. There are other smaller bumps that don't make the cut to be considered a gesture submovement. We apply the same thresholds to all participants in our dataset to facilitate comparison of the number of gesture submovements across participants. As always, I recommend checking your results with the raw video data. Now I'll play the video on the same timeline as our submovement plot. I'm playing the video at half speed so that you can more easily follow along. You'll see the red cursor moving along the bottom plot as the video plays. When the cursor reaches a black point, that indicates the speed peak for a given submovement. Leading up to each submovement peak, there is an acceleration phase, and after each peak, there is a deceleration phase. Let's watch it together now. One thing you might have noticed is that because we identified gesture submovement peaks and the entire continuous movement signal, these peaks correspond not only to gesture strokes, but also to preparation and retraction phases. For example, the submovement peak in the clip on the left was a speed peak associated with this retraction. And the submovement peak in the clip on the right was a speed peak associated with this preparation movement. In between submovements, the speed approaches zero. The highlighted regions of this plot indicate moments when the speed of the right wrist is low. These moments of low speed can be very short, for example, quickly changing direction, or they can be sustained, for example, in a gesture hold or resting position. Just because the speed of the wrist is low, it does not indicate that the wrist is low in space. Speed can be close to zero if the hand pauses movement in any position. Now that you know where gesture submovements peak occur in our continuous movement signal, we can link them to our ELAN annotations. For example, we could count the number of submovements that occurred within each gesture stroke, like you see in this example where we have 3 submovements in a single stroke. Next, we'll take a look at gesture holds and how we can detect them kinematically. As a reminder, a gesture hold is a pause in hand movement before or after a stroke where the hands remain communicatively active. Gesture research tends to focus a lot on gesture strokes, but gesture holds actually serve a lot of interesting functions for communication. They can provide durable semantic traces, keeping meaningful information from the gesture stroke active in space for longer. They can also play a role in turn-taking, for example, a speaker signaling to hold their turn or waiting for confirmation of understanding from their listener. And they facilitate the timing and synchronization of gesture with information in speech and are linked to speech disfluencies. Kinematically, we define a gesture hold as an event in which the elbow, wrist, and index finger are in a stable position, below a given speed threshold for at least 300 milliseconds. We require that the elbow, wrist, and index finger are all below the speed threshold to ensure that the participant's entire arm and hand are still. For example, some gesture strokes move all three joints together, but for other gesture strokes, it's possible to move only the wrist or only the index finger. We want to make sure that everything is still. And we choose a minimum length of 300 milliseconds because previous research has reported that 300 milliseconds is long enough that we visually perceive it as a pause in movement. So let's take a look at an example from our data set. This participant says, "I can still hear the hushed tones." She produces 2 gesture strokes with a post-stroke hold after the second one. I will play it for you now.
I can still hear the hushed tones.
She produces this gesture with her left hand, but both her left and right hand are in a stable paused position during the gesture hold. I'll play it one more time.
I can still hear the hushed tones.
This is a plot of this participant's speed data across the entire video. The upper plot is the right hand, and the lower plot is the left hand. And we have separate lines showing the speed of the elbow, wrist, and index finger. As you might expect, the speed of the movement is lowest in the elbow and highest in the finger. But the amplitude of the movement tends to pattern together across the joints. So when one joint moves, the others tend to follow it. And like you noticed when we analyzed gesture submovements, the speed of the joints is never really at 0. There is always some amount of movement. So you might be asking the same question as before. How do we decide on our speed threshold? How fast can a joint be moving and still be considered to be in a held position? We're actually going to use the same adaptive threshold that we used for height and prominence thresholds. We calculate the median speed of the left and right wrist across all participant videos, including both active moments of gesturing and rest phases, and this corresponds to 0.2 units per second in this data set. So to be considered a hold, all 3 joints for both hands need to be moving at a speed of less than 0.2 units per second. And as I said before, the duration of the gesture hold has to be at least 300 milliseconds. So in this 45-second video, we identified 7 gesture holds using these criteria, indicated by the gray vertical shaded regions. And as before, it's really important to check your kinematic analysis results with the raw video data. This time I'll start about halfway through the video because that's when the majority of gesture holds start. Let's watch this video together and see what moments our analysis identified as a gesture hold. This time I'll play it at full speed so that you can see how fast our 300 millisecond threshold is. In this tutorial, we look at moments when both hands are held simultaneously, but you could also adapt it to analyze left and right hand separately for gesture holds. This analysis gives you information about both how many gesture holds there are and the duration of each gesture hold. One thing that facilitated our analysis of gesture holds was using our ELAN annotations for gesture units. We only identified gesture holds as movement pauses within gesture units so that we didn't confuse them with resting positions. Remember that gesture units include the entire span of time from when a speaker raises their hand from a resting position until they return to a resting position. We know that if the hands are held in a paused position at any time during a gesture unit, it has to correspond to a gesture hold because by definition, the hands are not at rest. If you don't have gesture units annotated with your ELAN data, but you do have gesture strokes annotated, you can try to differentiate between gesture holds and resting positions by checking whether the hold occurred immediately before or after a stroke. However, it is possible that some strokes are launched directly from a rest position. Another possibility is that you use motion tracking to automatically identify all possible hold candidates, but then have someone manually classify whether the hold events are true gesture holds or resting positions. I'll quickly highlight now a couple of research papers that examined gesture submovements and holds. This paper by Trujillo and colleagues examined how speakers adapt their gesture kinematics when communicating in different levels of noise. The authors found that increased noise was associated with speakers producing a larger number of gesture submovements and longer hold times, indicating that speakers produce gestures that are more complex, contain more movement repetitions, and are more clearly segmented in noisy conditions. For a second example, I'm going to use an example from my own research that is currently available as a preprint but not yet accepted for publication. We looked at how speakers adapted their gestures for listeners with different levels of knowledge in group or multi-party communication settings. We also compared whether adults with moderate severe traumatic brain injury showed similar evidence of audience design in their gestures to non-injured peers. We found that speakers produced more gesture submovements and were more likely to produce gesture holds when there was one or more naive listener in the group, showing evidence of audience design and the temporal structure of their gestures. We also found that participants with traumatic brain injury produced more gesture submovements than non-injured peers at baseline when all listeners in the group were knowledgeable. You can find more studies than these that have looked at gesture submovements and holds. I encourage you to dive into the literature, and as always, there are endless possibilities of how you might use these measures to answer interesting and novel research questions. I hope that you will find these measures useful for your own research. And with that, it's time to move on to our Jupyter Notebook tutorial and get some hands-on practice with these measures. Let's navigate to the Lecture 9 script folder and open the Jupyter Notebook for this tutorial. Select your kernel and choose the KLS environment. In this notebook, we will use the speed columns we calculated in Lecture 7 to identify gesture submovements and holds. As always, we will start by reading in our required packages. Run this cell now. Then we will read in our main merged motion tracking file from Lecture 7, which has our speed and velocity columns. Run this cell now, and you'll see the data frame preview below. Okay, so in this second section, we will identify gesture submovements. This measure is operationalized as the number of speed peaks in the motion signal. Each time the speed reaches a distinct peak, we count it as a potential submovement. In this first markdown section, there are some definitions and reminders from the lecture we just covered. As I mentioned in the lecture, we'll be setting the threshold for height and prominence to the median wrist speed across all participants in our datasets, including movements with and without active gesturing. So at the top, we are taking all of our speed data and calculating the 50th percentile. For our distance parameter, we want to set it to 200 milliseconds, which is defined here. However, we need to know how many frames that is. So we'll first estimate the sampling rate of our dataset so that we can convert temporal distance into frames. Now it's time to start looking for peaks. We'll create 2 empty columns in our data frame to store our results. Then we'll loop through every video in our data frame and use the find peaks function from the signal package to identify gesture speed peaks using our height, prominence, and distance values we just defined. We'll store the peak data in a binary way in our motion tracking data frame, where if the value of the columns peak L or peak R is 1, then that time point corresponds to a speed peak for the left or right wrist. Let's run this now and then look at the output below. If we scroll all the way to the right, we'll see our peak columns for the left and right wrist at the end. So here we see the first speed peak in the left hand, and one in the right hand further down. So let's visualize the gesture speed peaks for one of the videos in our dataset. We are going to choose the first video, which is indexed as 0, but you can change this number for other videos. Then we'll plot the line plots for the left and right wrist speed over time. And we'll also plot scatter plots showing points on the speed signal wherever the peak L and peak R columns are equal to 1. And then we have a horizontal dashed line showing our height threshold. You can run this cell, and then you can see that across the entire 45-second video, we identified quite a few speed peaks. This is really interesting for examining submovements across the entire continuous movement signal. But we might also be interested in our smaller segments of annotated gesture strokes. In the next code cell, we sum the total number of speed peaks produced by each hand within each unique stroke ID time series. If the gesture is one-handed, we only consider speed peaks produced by the active gesturing hand. Then we create a new summary data frame that contains submovement data for each gesture stroke. Let's run this cell now. You'll see that for each gesture stroke, we have a column for the number of left-hand submovements and the number of right-hand submovements. If the gesture is two-handed, max submovements is calculated as the maximum number of speed peaks produced by either the left or right wrist. You can see that some gesture strokes have just one speed peak, or submovement, and others have multiple. Let's visualize one of our gesture strokes. At the top, I'm selecting the cheeseburger video and stroke ID number 20. I'm displaying a video clip of this gesture that is stored in our screenshots folder. And then we are plotting the line plot and speed peak points for just this gesture stroke time series, similar to how we did it above for the entire video time series. Run this now, and let's watch the video. You might notice that there are kind of two distinct movements he makes with a very short pause in between. I'll play it one more time. This is what we see reflected in the plot. This gesture is two-handed and very symmetrical. We see two speed peaks occurring in each hand and a moment of deceleration in between them. Now let's compare submovement counts across our two participant groups. We're going to make a box plot comparing the max number of submovements per gesture stroke produced by either hand between the pattern and no pattern groups. So let's run this. And as before, we see that there is a lot of overlap between the distributions of these two groups. We can see that the median for both groups is one submovement per gesture stroke, indicating that the majority of strokes do not contain complex or repetitive movements. There are some strokes that had no gesture submovements detected, but this should be fairly rare since most gesture strokes are kinematically salient. And there are some cases where there are 4, 5, or up to 6 submovements. If you run this on your own data, I recommend checking these examples to see that the values you get make intuitive sense. So let's check the ELAN file from the Lecture 6 script folder to check this example with 6 submovements. If you hover over the dot, we see that it is the Christmas gift story, stroke number 4. So let's pull that up. In this case, it is a little bit hard to see distinct submovements, but we can see that the stroke is quite repetitive with her waving her hands back and forth. As before, we're keeping a running spreadsheet of our stroke kinematics data. So we'll read in the stroke kinematics data frame we saved in our Lecture 8 output file, and we'll merge it with the stroke data frame we just made that contains our submovement summary data. Then we'll save this updated version to the Lecture 9 output folder. If we preview it, we'll see that for each individual gesture stroke, we have our kinematic measures from earlier lectures and our new submovement columns at the end. Okay, so we identified gesture submovements, which correspond to speed peaks in our motion tracking data. Now it's time to look for gesture holds. Instead of looking for moments when speed is high relative to the surrounding motion signal, we're going to look for moments when the speed is low and sustained across wrist, finger, and elbow joints for at least 300 milliseconds. We are going to look for gesture holds within our gesture unit annotations, which remember, by definition, only include moments of active gesturing. Otherwise, it would be more difficult to automatically classify whether holds are true gesture holds or just resting positions. Using this code, we're going to add 3 new columns to our motion tracking data frame to indicate whether the left hand is in a sustained held position, whether the right hand is in a sustained held position, or whether both hands are held. First, we need to define our speed threshold. This is the value that speed must remain below for a sustained period of time. As I mentioned previously, we will use the same threshold as the height for the speed peak detection, which is the median speed of the right and left wrist across the entire motion tracking time series and across all participants. We define the hold speed threshold accordingly, and we set the minimum hold time to 300 milliseconds. We initialize our new columns and define a function called filter short runs that identifies when sequences of continuous true sequences start and end, and only keeps them if they are at least as long as the minimum length that we set, so in this case, 300 milliseconds. Then we loop through each video and unique gesture unit ID, and for each video frame, it determines whether the left and right arm are stable by checking whether the wrist, index fingertip, and elbow are all below our speed threshold. Then we filter out short runs of holds across frames if the duration is less than 300 milliseconds. We write and save these results to our data frame that indicate whether the left hand, right hand, or both hands are in a held position. Let's run this now, and in the preview we can see that at the beginning, all hands are moving, so we see false in all of our hold columns. But further down, we see an example where the left hand is in a held position. Next, we will visualize the holds for one of our videos. We are choosing the Life Cycles video, but you can change this to a different one if you want. We are plotting line plots for the left and right wrist speed, a horizontal line for the hold speed threshold, and then defining a function that will help us create vertical shaded regions to indicate periods of both hand holds. You can run this now. This video has 7 detected holds where this participant was actively gesturing, but both of her hands and arms were held in a stable position below our designated speed threshold. Next, we'll create a summary table of all detected hold events, specifically looking at moments when both hands are in a held position. This code goes through our motion tracking data frame and finds the start and end time of each continuous period of holds. It assigns each hold period a unique hold ID, and then creates a summary data frame that includes the start time, end time, and the duration of each hold. You can run this now. You can see that we now know when each hold starts and ends and how long it is. This is really useful because we can go back to the original video or ELAN file and inspect individual hold events. And we could even import these hold annotations directly into ELAN since we know the start and end times. That's it for this one. I hope you are feeling more comfortable understanding how changes in the speed signal correspond to features like gesture submovements and holds, and understanding how we can use motion tracking data to detect them semi-automatically. That brings us to the end of Lecture 9. Today, you learned how to detect gesture submovements and holds to quantify the temporal dynamics of a continuous movement signal. Lecture 10 is the last lecture in this lecture series. In the next lecture, we will focus more on quantifying the spatial properties of gestures, looking at things like gesture height, distance traveled, size, and spatial distribution maps of gesture. Thank you for following this lecture series, and we'll see you next time.